You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media on Thursday, October 3rd. I'm Sharon Stone. Coming up, we'll look at a pair of new laws that will help law enforcement appropriately deal with people who are living with Alzheimer's. Also, we'll unpack a ballot initiative that could have some huge implications for homeowners. And we ask the question, why is Halloween such a big deal around here? But first, a state law went into effect Tuesday that likely won't do much to reduce homeless rates in Central Florida, but is designed to remove the unhoused from public spaces. House Bill 1365, the Unauthorized Public Camping and Public Sleeping Bill, prohibits camping on streets, sidewalks, and in parks. It also requires municipalities to develop designated public spaces to allow for camping, pending the approval of the Florida Department of Children and Families. Supporters of the bill argue it's necessary to combat a public health threat. Supporters of the bill argue it is necessary to combat a public health threat posed by skyrocketing numbers of unhoused in the region. In addition to a lack of addiction and mental health services, untenable housing costs are driving up the area's unhoused population. Critics are concerned that arrests of unhoused Floridians will create more barriers to overcoming homelessness, as well as placing a strain on law enforcement services. Andrew Sullivan is an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration at UCF. With a team of faculty and student researchers, he developed the Collaborative for Homelessness Action, Research, and Transformation, or CHART, a collaborative effort to gather data on homelessness and use it to connect dots to effective policies. Sullivan's data analysis found a spike in arrests of Orlando homeless beginning a year ago. He joined Engage to discuss his team's findings and how it correlates to the anti-camping law that went into effect this week. Sullivan starts our conversation by explaining how the CHART team began by gathering data.
We did a public records request through the Orange County clerk for any arrest for municipal ordinance violations. So things like camping outside, taking an object from a stopped car, which is usually how panhandling is cited. And so for any arrests for municipal ordinance violations for people experiencing homelessness, we asked to go back as far as we could. And so they provided data since August 2019 through April 2024 when we made the request. And so one thing we saw was before 2023, there were generally like maybe 20 to 40 arrests in a given month for people experiencing homelessness for one of these ordinances. What we started seeing in 2023 was an increase to about 60 to 80 people per month. In October of last year, we saw almost 120 arrests for these violations alone for people experiencing homelessness. And so this means that there's been a very big increase in arrests for people experiencing homelessness for these ordinances.
Any thoughts on what that spike in 2023 could be attributed to?
So I've talked some with the city and the police department, and they said they started some new interventions downtown, especially, which is where we see most of these arrests occurring. And so this includes connecting people experiencing homelessness to services, but it also could be that there's more people on the street. They see people taking these activities such as panhandling or camping outside and are therefore more likely to be arrested. Another explanation is there's more people experiencing homelessness in Central Florida. And so that means there's just going to be more people doing these things to survive, such as camping outside or maybe asking for money from drivers.
Andrew, I want to ask you about the arrests that we're talking about here. You talked about some ordinance violations. Are these the kind of issues that stay on a record and that could make it harder for someone to get work or shelter moving forward?
Yes, and so what we were looking at were not just informal warnings. We were looking at formal arrests, and so we were looking at arrest affidavits, which means someone is now in the criminal justice legal system. And so this means that they now have a record conceivably, and this could make it harder. Research often finds that having a criminal record is one barrier to employment, which could make it harder to be able to afford housing, and then also potentially to find housing because now potential landlords could see that this person has a criminal record. And even if it's for something as simple as camping outside, they see this record and that can make it harder to find housing and kind of create the cycle where it's harder to get out of housing. And so now they're more likely to take these behaviors again.
We touched on this briefly in the beginning. Just beyond the data analysis, your team is looking at policy implementation, including this anti-camping ordinance we're talking about. What have your researchers found? Do anti-camping laws reduce homelessness?
So in one of my studies, we look nationwide across communities across the country. And what we did was we looked at communities that passed an anti-homelessness ordinance, such as an anti-camping law, and we compare them to communities that haven't adopted them or would adopt at a later date. We didn't find any evidence of a decrease, and instead maybe potential an increase in homelessness. And kind of our story we're putting together, what we see here is that these laws, they maybe reduce homelessness in a very specific area. There's been some other studies that show that after a law is enforced in an area, people experiencing homelessness move to a different area, but it's usually just a couple blocks away. And so it's not doing anything to get them into housing directly, especially if there's not enough services in the community. And then people experiencing homelessness still need to find somewhere to sleep. And so what happens often is they maybe go even further away from services. They start sleeping in areas where they're less likely to be found, both by police and by service workers who might be trying to connect them. And so what we found was these laws likely are not reducing homelessness in an area. Instead, what research finds is that anti-camping ordinances often push people into experiencing homelessness into areas where they're less likely to be found, both by police and by service workers who might be able to connect them to services. Research also finds that often, even if someone moves because of these laws, they usually just move a few blocks away. And so the core issue is if there's not enough services or there's not enough housing for them to exit homelessness, these types of laws don't do much to decrease homelessness in a community.
So what do they do?
What the laws do then likely is further disconnects people experiencing homelessness from services likely. One could create the cycle again where people are getting arrested for violating these ordinances. This was part of the Grants Pass debate over the summer with the Supreme Court decision, where if there's no services in an area, could someone experiencing homelessness still be arrested just for sleeping outside? And they decided, yes, that's the case. And so what this means is just to survive, someone might need to sleep outside in some public space, such as under a bridge or in a park. They could be arrested even when there's no services. And so these laws create situations like this, where people might need to be further away from services and harder places to find. And so it kind of perpetuates a cycle of moving the discussion further away from getting people into housing and more into punishing people experiencing homelessness for behaviors they have to take to survive.
Have you had any kind of discussion about what you found with Orlando police?
Yes, so we had a couple of discussions, especially where things potentially line up. I know they're doing a lot more with the homelessness intervention unit to try to connect people into services, and that arrests are a very small portion. I think they said about 2% of these interactions. But what we're finding too lines up with this, where even though it's only a small portion of interactions and maybe they're connecting people to services and helping to protect people too, it's still been increasing and it's still a major issue. Again, one of our key findings was we looked citywide for violations of municipal ordinance violations and arrests for these behaviors, but typically over 60% of the arrests were people experiencing homelessness. And so this kind of suggests that how they're being enforced might disproportionately target certain people, again, partly because people experiencing homelessness are likely the person to be camping outside or sleeping under a bridge or panhandling. And so we've had a couple of discussions around these data and what we're seeing and how this lines up with what they're seeing.
And have you had any type of conversation with the organizations who are helping the homeless or unhoused people and how to implement your data in that way?
Yes, so this project actually came to us from the Christian Service Center. Eric Ray, the director there, came to me and said that their guests were getting arrested more often and if we could look into that. And so we didn't know that there had been an increase in arrests or the share of arrests for municipal ordinance violations that were people experiencing homelessness. I came at this from a researcher of wanting to know what's the situation, what's going on. And so what we found again was that there was an increase in arrests, and out of the people being arrested for municipal ordinance violations, the share of those people that were experiencing homelessness increased. And so I've been presenting the data to him. I know he's looking at some different solutions. They hosted a conference about a month ago too, related to the issue, bringing together different partners to discuss this, especially from different perspectives, such as a legal perspective or involving the faith community. in how we help people experiencing homelessness. And so I'm hoping it will help inform potential solutions going forward to help people experiencing homelessness find housing.
It's just broken down further by demographics. I'm wondering if there is any kind of disproportionate impact based on gender or race.
Yes. So we found for the municipal ordinance violations for people experiencing homelessness, almost 90% were men and just over half were Black men. And so this kind of corresponds, though, with the unsheltered homeless population in Orlando. While it's overrepresented compared to Orange County or Orlando, just resident demographics, once we consider who might be taking these actions, such as sleeping outside, it kind of corresponds, but there's still this disparity here where, again, over half of the rest were Black men, and knowing different structural issues in Orlando and in cities across the country for who becomes homeless, this would suggest a major disparity here.
And I realize this is speculative, but are you anticipating from these numbers, looking ahead, are you expecting them to go up further as the ordinance takes effect?
There's a potential, but we would sort of need to know how these are going to be implemented. Often with state law, there's very general guidelines, and this would be one of those cases where it says that cities need to do something, but there's not necessarily funding or clear direction. And so some of it is up to the local community of how we'll implement these laws. A solution, again, could be if creating low barrier shelter, which I know Orlando is in discussions of, and this could be really helpful for the situation to help avoid arrest and help connect people to services. And so I think it depends a lot on the local community's reaction to the state law.
Andrew Sullivan is an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration at UCF. There's more ahead here on Engage. The Alzheimer's Association of Florida calls the disease a growing public health crisis in a state where more than 500,000 residents live with it. Next, how brand new laws will change the way law enforcement handles encounters with people living with dementia. If you miss any part of the show today, you can always subscribe to the Engage podcast and listen when it's convenient for you. The program will be available on demand at cfpublic.org. This is Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Ahead on this program, Halloween seems to be a year-round event in Central Florida. We'll learn about how people around here became obsessed with the holiday.
I found in newspapers was like 1912 reports of mischief happening and vandalism even, and how it kind of evolved Halloween as a holiday from this mischief of like trying to control, young kids.
Rachel Williams of the Orange County Regional History Center joins Engage. But first, new state laws went into effect this week impacting people living with Alzheimer's and the people who care for them. Just to give you a sense of how many families are impacted, the Alzheimer's Association of Florida shared some numbers with us, reporting more than 50,000 people living with the disease in Orange, Osceola, Lake, and Seminole counties combined. That number doubles to more than 100,000 if you add in Brevard, Volusia, and Polk. One of the new related laws that went into effect October 1st involves training law enforcement. It creates continuing education courses on dementia for officers, so they're equipped to handle encounters with people living with Alzheimer's. A second law involves designating a diagnosis on motor vehicle registrations. During the application process, applicants can voluntarily indicate a disability or disorder, including Alzheimer's, so that information is readily available to law enforcement during an encounter. Jennifer Braystead is Director of Government Affairs for the Alzheimer's Association of Florida. She joined Engage along with Cheryl Ann Haley, an advocate for the Alzheimer's Association and caregiver for her mother who was diagnosed in 2018. We talked about the real-world impact of the changes now in effect in Florida. Jennifer Braystead explains why these laws in particular were a priority for the organization.
Due to the realities of Alzheimer's disease, individuals living with the disease, because of their inability to remember places and their potential to wander, it's just so critical that law enforcement has the tools and resources really needed to better equip them to be out in the community and to work with individuals living with Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. A huge issue that we see is when it comes to wandering. 6 in 10 individuals with dementia will wander at least once during their Alzheimer's journey. So that is extremely critical. And so any of these tools, especially HB 801, which is the law enforcement training, that's giving law enforcement those resources that they need to help understand communication styles, whether that's verbal or nonverbal, and also those de-escalation strategies to really help ensure there's no situations that elevate into a crisis.
Jennifer, were you hearing anything from either families or law enforcement about needing this type of training?
So it's something that we have seen and we receive feedback from families, but also the Alzheimer's Association, our local programs team, have been getting requests from sheriff's offices to provide this training. So really, we wanted this legislation because there have been other bills, one that went into effect in January, which is HB 1275, which created a voluntary special needs registry. And so that persons with disabilities registry, we thought that there really need to be training that accompanied that. But now with HB 801 going into effect, law enforcement will actually be able to get continuing education now for this curriculum, which they have been asking for. And so now they'll actually be able to get credit for it.
Cheryl Ann, if I could go to you now, you testified before lawmakers about Alzheimer's disease and dementia training for law enforcement and correctional officers. Can you share with me what you told them?
So I testified twice in Tallahassee and just shared the importance of law enforcement understanding what type of situation they're walking into. And so in my mother's situation, she's very independent. So I was always at fear if something happened that she would say no to an officer. And if he didn't understand her no, or that she would freeze and not respond to him, that it would have bad consequences.
Can you think of any other real life scenario where this training could really affect the outcome in a good way?
So my mother did wander a couple times. She was picked up by a sheriff's deputy once in the middle of the night. And when they asked her what she was doing, she told them that she was looking to purchase some property in Tampa because she's a lifelong realtor, but she was picked up at 2:00 in the morning. And so if somebody didn't know, at 2:00 in the morning on a Friday night in Tampa, you probably think they're medicated or under the influence. And so thankfully, those officers that picked her up understood what was going on and were able to find where she was and bring her home. In another circumstance, she went for a walk and got locked out of the house. And my stepfather woke up with an officer standing over him for a domestic violence charge. And so as he started to explain that my mother had dementia and was not able to drive, the deputy did not understand that. And so he pushed my mom's car out of the garage and jump started it and sent her on his way. And so the implications of that are just amazing to me because that could have ended tragic for my mother. It could have ended tragically for another family. And that deputy, I spoke to him. He believed that he was doing what he was signed up for, protecting and serving people. And he thought he was protecting my mom when really he was sending her into danger because he didn't have the education he needed in that situation. And that really is a heartfelt reason for me to be driving up to Tallahassee and sharing my story.
And Jennifer, after listening to some of what Cheryl Ann has experienced firsthand, do you have any thoughts as to what this training could look like for law enforcement?
So we've heard from so many different advocates. We had over 100 advocates actually travel during this past session to advocate for this legislation. And so many of them shared stories that were so similar to Cheryl Ann, or instances where maybe their loved one did wander, but a neighbor found them, but it could have escalated to the point where law enforcement were involved. Really critical things that she mentioned was those de-escalation strategies, but understanding also Alzheimer's disease, understanding what the warning signs might look like. Because the thing is, you may see an individual and think, oh, they're fine, but they could be in their 40s, 50s, 60s, living with Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. And you don't think that. You might think stereotypically of an older adult in their late 70s, 80s, but that's not the reality of Alzheimer's disease necessarily. Also, communication strategies. Individuals may be nonverbal, so understanding that. And also with verbal, like ways to calm presence, not necessarily in those strong, harsh tones that may put individual off. Understanding behaviors, looking at ways to approach someone who may have more aggressive, hostile behaviors without the need for physical restraint. Those are key. And then also knowing signs of abuse, talking about Cheryl Ann's case, they could have said, okay, well, this doesn't look like a domestic abuse situation. So especially with an individual with Alzheimer's where they may not able to verbalize that, but having the officer know those signs. So those are some of the requirements that are in the legislation to ensure that that's included in the training.
Did you experience any pushback as you were moving these new laws forward?
So this was actually unanimously passed in the House and the Senate. We had over 25 co-sponsors in the House. So it was really positively received.
We spent a lot of time, rightly so, speaking about this training that law enforcement will be going through. Another law I wanted to ask you about, it's talking about legislation updating the Florida Motor Vehicle Registration Application process, also called the Safeguarding Families Everywhere Act. Can you talk to me about the impact of that as well?
When you really look at it and you talk about some of the issues that caregivers may face, and we talked about wandering as a big issue, but it's another tool for caregivers to be able to utilize. So what that does is that allows caregivers to voluntarily update their vehicle registration, indicating that somebody has a disease. It's not Alzheimer's specific. It can be for anything. It does not disclose the disease, but it puts on the vehicle registration what they call a safe designation. So if law enforcement pulls over an individual or there's an accident and they look up that registration, they are going to be able to see that that's safe. So they are going to know that either the passenger or the driver has some disease. Now, that could mean that they aren't able to properly communicate. That could be hesitation because it is for many different diseases that's eligible for. But that allows caregivers to have that added protection that they want to make sure that their loved one's safe, especially if a loved one who has Alzheimer's is still driving.
And back to you, Cheryl Ann. How are you feeling with these new laws going into effect in October?
I think they are just going to help us make people more aware. Police officers, law enforcement being more aware is just getting more word out there. The registration thing is a key point. As Jennifer was talking, I remember a point in time that I got into a small traffic stop. And looking back on it still now, this was before my mother was diagnosed, she totally panicked in that moment. I was driving the car. She totally panicked. And in retrospect, it was really kind of hard to calm her down at that point in time. So if we were involved in some kind of situation and the officers, I had that on my registration and they knew, they would know better how to handle that. And I think that's very, very important.
Jennifer Braisted is Director of Government Affairs for the Alzheimer's Association of Florida. Cheryl Ann Haley is an advocate for the Alzheimer's Association, whose mother was diagnosed with the disease. Coming up, Amendment 5 on the Florida ballot could decrease property taxes for some homeowners, but increase taxes for other residents. We'll learn how Amendment 5 could impact what you pay. You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. When Florida voters cast their ballot, they'll be asked to weigh in on a number of constitutional amendments. The outcome of their vote on Amendment 5 could impact property taxes and what homeowners will pay in the state that's experiencing skyrocketing home values. Amendment 5 would provide an annual adjustment for inflation for the value of the homestead property tax exemption. It is worth noting this does not include school district taxes. Dale Brill is Chief Policy Officer for Habitat for Humanity of Greater Orlando and Osceola County. The organization offers free courses to the public to teach people about homeownership, property taxes, and financial literacy. Brill joined Engage to break down the implications of Amendment 5. He starts a conversation by explaining the ballot initiative.
So Amendment 5, depending on your perspective, from my understanding, if you look at legislative intent, right, and I'm basing that on the comments and interviews I've seen from the sponsors in the legislature and those that have come out in favor of it. The legislative intent is to try to offset the property taxes in the state of Florida that continue to increase and become cost prohibitive, certainly for those that are on fixed incomes. So retirees in particular, senior citizens, but also it lowers property tax, which is a disadvantage for the state of Florida over time because it just makes it more expensive for the total cost of home ownership. It gets higher and higher. So it lowers that tax burden for those of us that have taxes paid on a primary residence.
What does a yes vote on Amendment 5 mean then?
Well, it depends. You have to, I can't pretend to get inside the minds of the voters. For some voters, it is anything that lowers taxes is a good thing. There are folks that want to see taxes be lowered. It can be a very rational decision for folks who look at their property taxes as a total expenditure in their family budget and say any relief to my family is good relief. And so I would be in favor of it. So you've got anything from an ideological, philosophical, low taxes is a good thing perspective, and you have those that are facing the reality of increased property taxes that make it very difficult to stay here, to continue to live in the neighborhoods that they're currently in, pushing folks to move from Orange County or one county into another where the taxes would be lower.
On the flip side, who would someone be who would object to this then?
Not pretending to know the minds of voters, but still, you look at the spectrum of rationale that might be to vote no against this. It can be, it's not that they're for taxes necessarily. I don't think anybody, says, yes, I'd like to wake up and pay 10% or whatever the percentage is one day that I want to pay more taxes. I don't think anybody wakes up and says that. However, when you recognize that taxation is a form of revenue, governments must have revenue if we expect governments to provide services for us, right? And so you look at first responders, you look at things that cost money that have to be spent. And I'm not mentioning education because this particular proposal is for the homestead exemption. It's called the non-school local government property taxes, right? So it sets education outside of that. But if you see that the revenue reduction that is implicated by this amendment, and in fact, the initial estimates are that in 25-26 fiscal year, it would be roughly $23 million. I think it's like 22.8 million. But it increases in a few years with those losses reached on local governments in excess of $112 million. That's less money that government has to provide the services that we all benefit from. And so if you're looking at it from that perspective of, no, do I want to pay more taxes? Again, I don't think people wake up and want to do that. But you might consider the more complicated systems impact of reducing revenues to local governments that are created by this amendment. So in that sense, it's a tax shift because as Milton Friedman and other economists from multiple academic institutions will tell us, there is no such thing as a free lunch, right? Government services are not getting any cheaper. In fact, with the influx of residents that continues to pour into Central Florida, and Florida as a state in general, it's not going to get any cheaper to take care of those folks. So that money, when I say it's a tax shift, that money has to come from somewhere. And so when local governments find themselves with, let's say, $112 million less per year, well, then they may be tempted to raise taxes elsewhere. And so that's why I use the phrase, it can be seen as a tax shift.
Why would someone who isn't a homeowner, is not a property owner, vote on this at all then?
Well, if you're not a property owner, I think, again, there are implications for renters that don't necessarily benefit from the tax reduction. And again, the rental properties, then those investors, those types of folks won't benefit either. And so if you're a what's in it for me mentality, there's a reasonable argument to be, well, I'm going to vote either way on this, right? As you suggest, what if I just sit it out? And I guess just from my perspective on that point, it's that from a duty perspective, right? I'm old school, and the number one right that my dad told me about him is that I get to vote and I get to have a voice in what happens, even though it's just one. And there are the cynics in the world that say, well, my vote doesn't count anymore. Well, if you think that way and you don't vote, you're guaranteed that your vote doesn't count. So they should weigh in and again look at the full spectrum of implications, and that's what makes this amendment so difficult. Because if you can look at it from two different directions. If you're looking at it for what's in it for my family, it can make overwhelming evidence be there for, yes, I want that tax break. If you're thinking longer term and the implications of reduced revenues to local government, and you see yourself as benefiting both short, mid, and long term from those government services, and you understand that money's got to come from somewhere, then you might be inclined to say, okay, I'm going to vote no on this. I'm going to push it back and look for a more comprehensive tax policy rather than, find that one thing that reduces taxes and pull that lever without any contemplation of the myriad of impacts that cascade as a result of a well-intentioned and good tax reduction policy, but it has cascading effects.
So Dale, in your role with Habitat for Humanity, Greater Orlando and Osceola County as Chief Policy Officer, what do you tell first-time buyers who are trying to navigate this market? How do you even break down the homestead property tax exemption value?
Sure. Well, here's the good news, Sharon, is that we've got people far better at this than Dale Brill. And I know you were talking about the organization, not me, but Habitat for Humanity has extensive programming. In fact, we are a HUD-certified counseling portfolio of programs in which we educate and sit down with homeowners, because the cost of ownership is absolutely critical to understand the implications on your checkbook down the road, right? So sometimes, for example, this may surprise you, and this is another example of unintended consequences. When an interest rate is very, very, very low, and that on its face is, well, that's a good thing, right? That's more access to capital. People can get lower payments. Yes, but what we see in human behavior is that people with lower interest rates tend to buy more house, right? And when you buy a bigger house, your cost of ownership, yard upkeep, heating and air conditioning, the filtration system, all the things that come with home ownership are bigger with a bigger house. And so these kinds of relationships are the types of things that we walk through in our programs and services as part of a full comprehensive approach to home ownership that Habitat has focused on in the last several years. And in fact, our history, right? I mean, Habitat is a brand. Yes, we build homes with people. We enable people to have access to affordable housing, but we also are looking at their capacity and capability to be the best and most prepared homeowners and even renters that they can be.
And what else would you like our audience to take away as they head into the voting booth and look at Amendment 5?
As a former bureaucrat in Tallahassee, running an agency and looking at those dynamics and what the legislature has the most difficult job in the world. I mean, it's a thankless job, right? I mean, you go up there and they aren't doing it certainly for the money on the paycheck, but they do it because they're committed to their communities. And what I see out of Amendment 5, and in fact, the whole spectrum of amendments, is both public activism, community activism, individual activism, and also a legislature that's trying to respond to the difficult challenges that we are facing as a state. I would have my fellow citizens know, though, that these solutions are so complex that the paradox is that you have to make policy as simple as possible so that people can understand it and either support it or decide to be against it. But the simpler a policy is, in contrast to the complexity of the problem, chances are that solution isn't going to put a dent in the real problem. And in fact, it could make it worse. So the need for consumers, and we are as voters, consumers of government, for us to be consumers of government and voters, the onus has never before been as heavy on us as it has been in the past to be involved, to do the homework, to reach out. I mean, we've got, between all the search engines and Chat GPT, do the homework and be as well informed as you can possibly be when you walk into that ballot box.
Dale Brill is Chief Policy Officer for Habitat for Humanity of Greater Orlando and Osceola County. Coming up, it is October and we are squarely in the spooky season. We'll uncover the evolution of Central Florida's Halloween attractions. All of our shows are available on demand at cfpublic.org. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. We're in that time of year where we celebrate seasons. The holiday season drawing closer. Other states are getting into the fall weather season. For some, the most coveted time of year of them all is the spooky season. Halloween inspires events around Central Florida, from the theme parks to trick-or-treating to haunted houses. At the History Center in Orange County, they're uncovering the origins and the evolution of our region's scary and silly traditions that entice people to celebrate around Halloween. Historian Rachel Williams is presenting a Lunch and Learn event Friday, October 4th, focused on the history behind Central Florida's spooky-themed attractions. We started the conversation with her here on Engage by asking Rachel, why is Halloween such a big deal here?
I think Halloween has become a big deal nationally. I think our impact in Central Florida leans in a lot to the theme parks that we have here and the events that they've come out with, which has only exponentially grown the industry again nationally overall. So I think it's just the amount of theme parks we have and the events that they've started putting on that has boosted the popularity of the holiday.
Can we pinpoint the earliest Halloween event or attraction in our area?
Yes, in a way. So Disney kind of did a couple little things. It wasn't anything that was huge. So, they would have on Halloween or like the weekend before or something, you can come to the Haunted Mansion for free, that was during a time in the 70s when every ride cost money. You had to have a ticket for each ride and you had to purchase that. So, for Halloween, you could come to the Haunted Mansion for free. And then they would also do screenings of Sleepy Hollow, the Disney cartoon, and kids could come and dress up in a costume and get candy and that kind of thing. But it wasn't anything quite as large as what happened in the 90s when we had Halloween Horror Nights. That was the big kind of boom. There was also a couple others before Halloween Horror Nights, a couple smaller events at now defunct theme parks. There was one at Watermania, and was in Kissimmee, and then one at Circus World out in Haines City. They also had just a little haunted house for a weekend, and then Watermania had a haunted forest maze behind the park. But again, it was just kind of for the weekend. But then in the 90s, when Halloween Horror Nights, the first year was Halloween Fright Nights, that again was only 3 nights, kind of low key, but it was very popular. So they did it again the next year, adding it to, I think, 5 nights. And then it just kind of grew and literally exploded from there. So yeah, started basically kind of in the 70s with little celebrations, I would say, from Disney. But what really, really kicked it off was Halloween Horror Nights from Universal.
So is this kind of being driven by a competition to out Halloween each other at the parks?
I wouldn't necessarily call it that. So
okay.
Halloween Fright Night started in 1991, which was Disney's 20th anniversary. So it was a competition between the theme parks themselves, not necessarily to out Halloween each other, but because it worked for Universal, everyone else was like, let's, kind of jump on that train, because October was historically a kind of slower period for the theme parks. It'd pick up in Christmas, especially at Disney, because they had the Very Merry Christmas Party already at that time, but they're not, known for Halloween. So they kind of created a kid-friendly, family-friendly event to accommodate that audience that they have. So it wasn't necessarily competition. It was more so, hey, that's working for them. Let's implement that for our audience. But it was definitely competition between theme parks in general.
I just kind of want to take this conversation outside of the theme parks and into the communities of Orlando. How did it grow beyond the walls of our major theme parks?
Yeah, so I've talked to a number of people who have worked in the haunt industry, as they call it, and it kind of goes beyond just Halloween into the idea or the category, the genre of horror in general, and how people use horror as an escape through that adrenaline rush that they get through being scared. And I think that Halloween is a number of those things. They're definitely an element of horror and that adrenaline rush of being scared, but it's also a nostalgic feeling, I think, for a lot of people of being a child and getting to dress up as whatever you want and, getting candy and just having like this fun little experience where you can be kind of creative and be this new person or creature or whatever it is that you like to be. So there is that element of remembering your childhood and embracing that childhood as well. So I think it's a lot of things that comes out of it that is more than just theme parks. It is embracing your childhood, fun spirit kind of thing.
And Rachel, tell me about your event on Friday.
Yeah, so I'm talking about the evolution of Halloween in North America. I'm not going too deep in it in terms of, its exact origins and stuff like that, but more so how it started as like this kind of mischief night, and it was kind of causing issues within cities, including Orlando. And I think the earliest I found in newspapers was like 1912 reports of mischief happening and vandalism even, and how it kind of evolved Halloween as a holiday from this mischief of like trying to control, young kids who were vandalizing the city into trick-or-treating and then into theme parks and events. And now this multi-billion-dollar industry, and how those events at theme parks, and not even theme parks, just smaller independent attractions, how all of that has attributed to the growth in the industry as a whole.
Rachel Williams is a historian at the Orange County Regional History Center and Historical Society. She's presenting the Lunch and Learn event on Friday from noon to 1. Here at Central Florida Public Media, we've put together a Halloween guide. This list includes all scare levels, from kid-friendly all the way to fright-of-your-life events. There's also an interactive map, details about each location, and a shriekometer rating scale to give you a sense of how scary that event claims to be. This guide could help you find some alternatives to the major theme park attractions in Central Florida. You can find the guide online at cfpublic.org. That's all for today's edition of Engage. We are back Tuesday at 3 o'clock. As always, we want to hear from you. Let us know what you'd like to hear more about, maybe what you're glad you heard. Send us an email to engage@cfpublic.org. I'm Sharon Stone. Thanks for joining us. All Things Considered is coming up following NPR News.